Okay, wonderful. So thank you so much, Richard, for joining me today. I was wondering, before we get started in earnest, if you'd like to share a brief self-intro.
Sure. I'm Richard Falk. I had been for a long time on the faculty at Princeton University from 1961 to 2001 as a professor of international law. Subsequent to that, I moved with my wife to Santa Barbara, California, and continued to be attached to University of California at Santa Barbara, as well as Queen Mary University in London. And surprisingly, at my age, I still do some teaching and writing within my areas of interest, which extend beyond international law to include international relations and a focus on the Middle East and global policy issues. I've been particularly concerned with the Arab-Israeli struggle and with the wider implications of racial discrimination and apartheid. I had been an official observer of a major South African trial from, I guess it's now almost 50 years ago, but it alerted me to the evils of structural racism that is given a kind of institutional legitimacy in the legal system of a sovereign state, which was true in South Africa and has been true for a long time, in my view, in Israel.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful, Richard. And speaking to some of your writing, I've already begun Citizen Pilgrim, and I'm reading it with great interest. That's your memoir. I'll have that in the show notes for people to access as well. And you talk about becoming involved in activism in the book. And perhaps it would be safe to say that it was something that for you began a little bit later in life, maybe with the Vietnam War. Was that a time that things started to appear to you as relevant enough, maybe, if that's a way of saying it, or urgent enough to now engage in activism as a person yourself?
Yes, I became clearer of that understanding of my own late entry into activist politics in the course of writing my memoir. I hadn't quite appreciated the degree to which I was influenced by the Vietnam War, which went on for a decade, and I had approached it initially as a issue of basically academic concern, and I thought it was a misuse and imprudent kind of foreign policy that was unlikely to succeed given the French experience in Indochina. But then I had the opportunity, which I took, to visit North Vietnam during the course of the Vietnam War. And that was for me a very transformative experience, because I saw the war not through the eyes of the American debate about the policy, but as a daily reality of a underdeveloped country vulnerable to the sort of high technology war that was being waged by the United States, and not only being waged, but being lost by the United States. And it both made me realize the political vitality of what was then called Third World nationalism, but also the essentially faulty moral, legal, and political attempt to fill the geopolitical vacuum left by the collapse of European colonialism by the United States. I think that was a huge mistake by the United States that is still being experienced and maybe re-experienced in the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, which in ways is an imitation of the experience in Saigon in 1975, when the United States was surprised by how quickly the government it had supported for more than a decade and had financed with billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, collapsed and displayed no political will to resist. So that it was a lesson unlearned in Vietnam and probably will be unlearned in Afghanistan as well.
Yes. Do you feel that your beginnings in activism, when you began to see these realities on the ground in Vietnam, was also a bridge for you into your involvement in the Palestinian cause?
I suppose in retrospect, it was a precedent at any rate. Although my next major involvement was not Israel-Palestine, but the Iranian Revolution, and which was I had the understanding that the United States was about to make this same kind of mistake in Iran that it had made in Vietnam, and that it was important to do my best to oppose those policies. And then after that, through a series of personal relationships and encounters, I became more active in the Israel-Palestine struggle, which I had avoided somewhat deliberately because I knew that it was so provocative in the American political context that I would be branded in a way that I didn't feel comfortable about, and it took me a period of time to say that's sort of cowardly, and I should accept the consequences of following my beliefs and not be intimidated by the reputational costs of doing so. And I have no regrets in looking back that was the right thing to do and has been a valuable experience for me in many ways. It was not just a matter of surviving defamatory attacks and other exclusions that can be traced probably to my support for the Palestinians in this long struggle, but really opened my eyes in ways to the distortions that occur at the United Nations, in geopolitics, in the public arena and the media as a consequence of the way reality is portrayed that reflects power more than principle. And so I feel I learned a lot by particularly the first in Vietnam and this most recent long one in Israel-Palestine.
Yes, and to speak actually perhaps to what you mentioned a moment ago about distortions and the UN, I was wondering, Richard, if you could maybe speak to how your experience doing so much for the Palestinian cause while in the UN changed or challenged your view of the UN because of the kinds of responses you got in the UN.
It was definitely an important factor, Paul. I came to understand the UN as an institution that was important in some respects, but very much subject to power politics in other respects. Mm-hmm. And this relationship between Israel and Palestine epitomized both aspects because there was strong consensus within the UN, especially from the non-Western countries, that justice to the Palestinians should be a high priority for the UN, and that it had so far failed in its efforts to find a solution to the problems that the British dumped in the lap of the UN when it just got started, because it can no longer handle its quasi-colonial role as the mandatory power. So that I came to understand and with increasing clarity, I think, that the UN is very important for what I call legitimacy wars. Mm-hmm. That is, who controls the high ground of moral and legal and even spiritual reality in a conflict situation, which is different from who has the upper hand in the battlefield or combat zone. And one of the unappreciated realities of the last 75 or so years is that the side that wins the legitimacy war usually controls the political outcome, not the side that prevails on the battlefield or within the confines of the combat zone. And unfortunately, this insight, which I think is supported by the historical record, is not shared by the political class that shapes American policy and the policy of most important countries in the world, that still believe that history is made by the side with the hard power advantages, and that hard power is the agent of historical change. This was somewhat descriptive of reality up until the 20th century, and maybe even to the middle of the 20th century, where colonialism and imperialism made efficient use of the military instrument to enhance their own prosperity and power at the expense of non-Western peoples. But in the last half of the 20th century and in the 21st century, the capabilities of nationalist resistance have shifted the balance of forces against foreign intervention. And even though this kind of regime-changing intervention can kill a lot of people and destroy unlimited targets, it still has not the capacity any longer to have its way politically. And again, Afghanistan is a immediate illustration of this, where the US spent over these 20 years at least $3 trillion, which it could have put to far better use at home or in various international settings. And yet it was unable to even build an Afghan army and police force that would enable it to make an orderly withdrawal, much less defend itself against the Taliban that, as far as we know, had very little, if any, significant external support. It was relied, for better and worse, on the capabilities of its own followers and its nationalist determination to expel foreign interveners. Our political class has no understanding, apparently, that we're living in a post-colonial world, and that to do what colonial powers were able to do is no longer a viable option. And at the same time, we've built a militarized state that can't learn that lesson, because to learn that lesson would carry with it the understanding that we've been vastly overinvesting in military capabilities. Our military budget, really, astonishingly, military budgets of the entire world. It is so far greater than the next 10 countries as to seem absurd, if seen in the abstract, and yet the US is as insecure as it's ever been in my lifetime anyway. So in other words, not only is military investment not a path to imperial type success or international expansion, it's also not a path to security, either domestically or in terms of global alignment.
Certainly, and I think that's such a telling response, Richard. I feel I should connect it with something I want to ask you later on, but I think it would be appropriate here. You know, I know that you've talked about the value or the need to move away from the Westphalian system, and I'm wondering whether you could speak to how that might be beneficial, not only just for the Palestinian struggle, or but also to moving, beyond post-colonialism.
Yes, that's of course a very fundamental question. The Westphalian system is so named after the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which was an end to it was an attempt anyway to end the religious wars within Christianity that were causing great destruction in Europe for the prior decades, including the 30 Years' War, so-called 30 Years' War, that ended with this Peace of Westphalia. And so the Peace of Westphalia both ended the religiously motivated ideas of political legitimacy, and they began in Europe the system of territorial sovereign states, that there was no law higher than the law of the state, and by extension that the law of the state and the sovereign who ran the state could establish the religion, an acceptable political that was part of sovereignty. And this system of sovereign states was gradually exported to the rest of the world and combined with European colonialism. And after the collapse of colonialism, this state system became the basis of world order and the foundation of the constitutional framework of the United Nations. And it had one very special feature that is not normally taken enough account of, and that is that although legally all territorial states that enjoyed sovereignty were equal, when it came to political arrangements, there were always a few actors that were not bound by this notion of states' respect for the state sovereignty of others. And this was even built into the UN system in the form of giving the permanent members of the Security Council, who were the winners in World War II, the power of vetoing anything that any decision by the UN that they disapproved of. And so it meant that the UN was established to hold the weaker countries accountable, but let the strong ones do what they wish. And that reproduced the system that had existed within this framework of Westphalian world order. We've reached the point with the climate crisis and the COVID pandemic, where it becomes obvious that global solidarity needs a system where there are no exceptions, there are no geopolitical exceptions, and have a global order that can enforce standards that serve the public good, and especially standards that are respected and implemented by the most powerful and richest actors within the system. So that's why I think it's important to talk about a post-Westphalian state, or post-Westphalian form of world order, but also it relates to what we talked about earlier in terms of political class that espouses political realism, but has lost touch with political reality.
Yes.
And it's that kind of reconnecting with political reality that might generate the political will to move away from this Westphalian anachronistic system. And maybe climate change and COVID provide a sufficient wake-up call to lead in that direction, hopefully.
Certainly. That's a wonderful response, Richard. I wanted to just pick up on what you were saying with respect to political class. I think such an appropriate phrase. Do you think that, in terms of what we're seeing in Israel right now and the oppression of Palestine, that it would be advantageous to talk about um, the state, the Israeli state, as a sort of political class rather than um, a sort of secular religious entity um, that is not really about religion at all, because I have had the privilege, to meet so many um, people of the Jewish faith in the solidarity movement, in the Palestinian solidarity movement, who've repeated so many times that Israel does not speak for them or for their Judaism. So I'm wondering really if it'd be advantageous for the movement to kind of think of this more in terms of a political class or political economic class oppression. Perhaps that maybe uses the language of religion, but not in a way that's sincere.
I think that raises very interesting and complex questions, because Zionism, as the ideological foundation of the Israeli state, started as a political project. It was not part of the Jewish religion, and many Jews up to today don't consider it as integral to a religious understanding of Jewish destiny or Jewish identity. And in that sense, one sees a kind of uniqueness in the Israeli claim to be a state of the Jewish people, not a state serving its whole citizenry. Netanyahu famously said in 2019, Israel is a state only serving its Jewish people. It gives basic right, but it does it as a privilege. He claimed it was giving basic rights to all its citizens, whether Jews or not, but that it was a Jewish state when it came to matters of national identity. So in that sense, the political class in Israel, the shaping the country's policies since its origins in 1948, subscribes to the realism that I've been suggesting is particularly characteristic of what the United States has been motivated to do in this period. And Israel is very derivative, I think, from that kind of thinking, that military power is what makes for history. And it's, of course, influenced by the sense that the Holocaust happened to Jews because they didn't act in their own self-defense with sufficient resolve. And the weakness was part of the tragedy. And so this has created again, a distinctive Israeli stress on force and control and a sense that one's future has to depend on the oppression of those that might threaten it in some way in the future. And then that there is a religious element, in my view, in this Zionist project, but it's instrumental. It's not a matter of religious belief, but it's an idea that in the Jewish tradition there is the image of the promised land of Palestine to which Jews would return. A kind of David Ben-Gurion, the first and perhaps most notable Israeli leader, said, "The Bible shall be our instrument." Mm-hmm. And he wasn't really, he was a totally secular leader. But Israel, because that was a very pragmatic understanding of the fact that from a moral point of view and a legal point of view, Israel had no basis for claiming to dispossess and ethnically cleanse the resident population. And the Zionist project was further complicated by the fact that they not only wanted to be in control and dominate the territorial space, but they wanted to have the legitimacy that goes with being a political democracy. South Africa never attempted that. They didn't pretend to be a democracy, and they didn't give citizenship or basic rights to Africans within their territory. But Israel had this important idea that it would be a much more successful realization of the Zionist goals if it were democratic. But the puzzle was it couldn't be democratic and in control so long as it was a demographic minority. So it needed to both expel and prevent the return of a large number of resident Palestinians or Arabs who were living in Palestine. And as you know, the war, the 1948 war, resulted in the permanent dispossession of between 700,000 and 750,000 Palestinians who were denied the right to return, which itself is a violation of international law and contrasts with the Israeli right given to any Jew, however remote the connection is with Israel, of a unconditional right of return. So you have this kind of racist idea at the very core of the Israeli undertaking. This is further complicated by the fact that history was that the establishment of history of Israel was swimming against the current of international history. In every sense, Israel is a settler colonial construction. The people came deliberately from outside of the region, largely from Europe and North America, and they had to establish at a time of collapsing colonialism a colonial undertaking. And this, they knew Jabotinsky, who was the ideological inspiration for the Likud party that's been governing Israel until very recently. he knew that any people in the 20th century would not be displaced willingly, that they would resist, and that Israel had to build, in his metaphor, an iron wall along its borders and be prepared for resistance from within. That, in other words, you couldn't foresee in the 20th, last part of the 20th century, the kind of passivity that many native peoples exhibited toward colonial powers who were able to impose their will, even though they were a minority. And so this, I'm mentioning all these factors because they are uniquely characteristic of the whole story of the success of the Zionist project. There's no other example of that, and its success was reinforced by geopolitical factors, the guilt felt by Europe and North America because they hadn't accepted Jewish refugees and hadn't done very much to stop Hitler's persecution of the Jews. So they felt that it was part of their obligation to support the creation of Israel, and especially with a kind of Orientalism, they didn't view the people that were resident as fundamental obstacles. They were, and this was part again of the Zionist mentality of pretending that Palestine was an empty land. And it gave rise to that famous saying, a people without
I think you got cut off there for a second, Richard. Yes.
Good. Are we?
Oh, sorry. I think yes. So yeah, we got cut off. You were saying the famous Zionist about a people.
Saying a territory without people for a people without territory.
Yes.
And that was an exaggerated version of this notion that the Palestinians could be erased from our moral consciousness, and that and that was all reinforced by the idea that Jews were making the desert bloom, and they were bringing progress to an area that was backward and undeveloped, and the blessings of European modernity were being generously provided to a area that had never before benefited from the Industrial Revolution and all that followed from that.
You know, Richard, I was thinking, you know, in reading the piece you sent me, where you talk about now Israel being very critical of trying to undermine the upcoming Durban anti-racism conference, and also entities like UN Watch. It gave me pause, you know, recently to think whether Israel wants to be part of the international community, or whether the Zionist project involves, you know, sort of this distancing itself from the international community. What, in your view, I mean, you having so much experience at the UN, in your travels to Palestine, also with your experience observing South Africa, writing about it, what do you feel is Israel's positioning right now? Is it interested in gaining acceptance from the world community, or does it really want to stay sort of in this sort of colonial context where it can do as it pleases, does not have to adhere to any international law? So,
I think, Paul, that's a really hard question to answer in a simple way. My view is that Israel is somewhat schizophrenic when it comes to its attitudes toward the international society. On the one hand, it craves legitimacy and acceptance, and on the other hand, it has adopted increasingly a posture of defiance toward international obligations or toward the UN itself. And so it has this kind of double vision of what it seeks. And the defiant part, I think, has prevailed up to this point, and it seems to be very much in the mentality of the settlement movement that has gradually gained authority and influence within Israel. And Israel has, especially during the Netanyahu years, given up the effort to please the international community. I mean, hasn't really pretended. It's very defiant. And in my case, and the case of the person that succeeded me at the UN, Israel doesn't try to meet substantive criticism with substantive responses. Rather, it deploys its formal propaganda capabilities in trying to avoid the message by damaging the messenger.
yes.
It's consistently, it didn't used to do that. It used to try to explain its policies and somewhat, in a somewhat strained way, justify them. But it gave up serious efforts to do this. And I think most people would agree that it's been losing the so-called, what I call the legitimacy war.
Yes.
The International Criminal Court has agreed that Israel's crimes since 2014 could be investigated, and that even if nothing comes of that, it's a big symbolic victory for the Palestinians. And generally, the Human Rights Watch report that finds, on the basis of exhaustive research, that Israel really has crossed the line to apartheid practices and policies. Israel's own B'Tselem human rights NGO has come to the same conclusion, not only for Israel proper, but for the territory that it occupied in 1967. Israel's own basic law, 2018, unabashedly puts forward the argument that Jews and only Jews have the right of self-determination within Israel, and it supports the settlement extensions of territorial Israel to the occupied Palestinian territories as what is described as integral to Israeli sovereignty, which is a way of saying we don't believe that it's necessary to have a Palestinian state, and it's a rejection of the two-state consensus that has dominated intergovernmental thinking and UN positions for a long time. I think it's become a kind of zombie solution because it's very hard to have any expectation that 600,000 or more Jewish settlers can be displaced and returned to Israel, and a viable Palestinian sovereign state can be established in the occupied Palestinian territories, which, it should be remembered, are only 22% of original Palestine, which is less than half of what the UN proposed in its partition resolution in 1947, which was controversial at the time. So Israel has, over time, enlarged its expectations, territorial and otherwise, and at the same time has shown a unwillingness to accept any sort of reasonable political compromise or allow for Palestinian realization of their basic rights, including self-determination.
Yes. I wanted to ask you, Richard, because you're so familiar, you've done so much work on the South African experience, and I think you've also alluded to it as well. Do you think like what is happening in Israel or Palestine is beyond apartheid? That there is, whether we call it ethnic cleansing, whether we call it genocide, whatever we call it, there's an attempt to fully eliminate the Palestinian people by the state.
I don't think that one can call it, at least from a legal perspective, genocide, because there's no demonstration of an intent to eliminate the Palestinian people. There is an intent to disperse them and to fragment the Palestinians. And that's why I think ethnic cleansing and dispossession, one can say that it has genocidal tendencies in the sense of trying to so diminish the identity and viability of an ethnic community that it threatens its destruction and treats the Palestinians as a discriminated, victimized minority. And if you look at the International Convention on Apartheid that was adopted by the General Assembly in 1974, you will see that Israel's practices and policies very much conforms to the definition given of apartheid. Now, you ask whether they've exceeded that. I think it's a particularly severe form of apartheid, and that was recognized by South African leaders like Archbishop Tutu and Nelson Mandela, who described way back the conditions facing the Palestinians as worse than what were faced by Black Africans in South Africa. But I think the conditions are really quite different in the sense that Israel has not engaged in what they called petty apartheid in South Africa. That is, they haven't forced non-Jews to use separate toilets and to have used different restaurants and hotels, and they haven't tried to draw a line of a racial line in everyday life in the same way. So it is somewhat less harsh as far as non-Jews are concerned who are living in Israel. It's discriminatory, and it subjugates the 17% non-Jewish minority to some harsh restrictions, but it can't be said to be quite as severe and dehumanizing as the South African apartheid system was. But as far as other features, such as the prolonged occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza, with its frequent military attacks, and the enclosure of Palestinians within these crowded territorial confines, and the dispersion of Palestinians to refugee camps in the region, that has gone on for so long that it is established a kind of special structure that seems to me to be a severe form of apartheid, even compared to South Africa.
I wanted to ask Richard, you make this very interesting, I would even say philosophical distinction in Citizen Pilgrim between what is necessary and what is feasible. And I'm wondering whether you think the international community with respect to justice for Palestine is more on the side of what is feasible, or more what is on the side of what is necessary?
I think for a long time it's been on the side of what is feasible. And I think what is necessary and desirable has been the work of civil society activism and the nonviolent efforts at global solidarity combined with Palestinian resistance efforts. In other words, I think the intergovernmental responses to deprivation of Palestinian rights has been limited to the feasible, which must be understood, I think, as basically not really satisfactory from even a minimalist sense. In other words, the continuing victimization of the Palestinian people cannot be overcome by the politics of feasibility. And it can only be overcome by the mobilization of global solidarity efforts in a manner that resembles the mobilization that was effective against South African apartheid, which was combined with various internal forms of resistance, non-cooperation, and making the country ungovernable. It's hard to anticipate the way in which the future will unfold. This last flare-up. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
This last flare-up, which sometimes has been called the unity intifada, did display some signs of a new phase in the Palestinian struggle and the attitudes of world opinion, especially the breakdown of the claim that Israel had made that its Arab minority was quite satisfied in Israel.
Right.
The riots that occurred in the several Israeli cities really showed that Palestinians were not reconciled to being second-class citizens within Israel.
Yes, certainly. And I think it's a very appropriate name too, because it's very hard to control the narrative now with social media, with independent media, this sort of sharing of information between activists and things like that. Whereas that was a little bit maybe more difficult to do during the time of the dominance of like major broadcast media, no social media being around, and the narrative being more easily controlled. I wonder, yeah, Richard, you've been so generous with your time. I know we've been talking for about an hour. I just wanted to ask you, because you've been so prolific in your life. You've written a tremendous body of work. How have you perhaps seen writing as a form of activism that can actually have real material impact in the world? I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, sort of bridging the literary with the material.
No, it's a searching kind of question, Paul. And I've given it some thought, especially in composing this memoir. And my view is that one writes, especially along these lines of political engagement, in terms of what one believes to be true and desirable and necessary in that language. And lets it enter the world stream, maybe tries to make it known to people that might be interested. But then you lose control of it. It's no longer your product. It's something you have conceived, and I find that writing is a kind of continuous learning process, sort of adult self-education, so to speak. And so one side of me does it for its own sake, because I've overcome my earlier anxieties about writing and find it enjoyable and fulfilling, and a way of connecting with people all over the world. And it's definitely enriched my life, and I hope has encouraged others to act in comparable ways. But I have no illusions that the pen is more powerful than the sword, but I think the pen has, or the laptop, as to be more accurate, has the capacity to articulate what becomes politically formidable in subsequent situations. There's no guarantee. We struggle for what we believe, and try to do the little we can to make it happen. But it's essentially a personal ordeal and struggle, I was struck by a statement attributed to Nelson Mandela that I came across recently, which says that the saint is the sinner who keeps trying.
Okay.
And I think, and Samuel Beckett, the Irish playwright, said, all we can do is try and experience failure, but we can fail better, as he put it. We can, and I think that's how I would characterize my own continuing efforts to disseminate a understanding of reality as I perceive it.
Wonderful. Yes, you're never quite sure how it resonates or when or what time people will pick it up and run with it. Well, thank you so much, Richard. I'm very grateful and honored to have you as a guest. I will let you know. Yeah, no, I will put together the audio and the video and have it released this week. I think it will be of tremendous value to people, to listeners, and I'll send it to you. And I'm going to continue reading Citizen Pilgrim. It's a long book, but I started. I wanted to get a little bit in before today's discussion, but I really am enjoying it.
But thank you, Paul. You've been a very congenial.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
You've challenged me in good ways.
Okay. Oh, that's a great compliment. Thank you so much.
The hidden recesses. And I wish you well, and I hope we have contact in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Richard. Okay. Okay, take care. Okay. Okay. Bye-bye.